Thank you all for taking the time for joining us today. Thank you to RADIANT-CERSI for inviting me to talk today. We'll talk later a little bit about where medical device regulations come from and why they matter to patients and clinicians. But really, I just enjoy sharing the knowledge that I have with people. So it's a lovely opportunity today to share some of that knowledge with you all. My name is Daniel Mannion. I'm the Director of Professional Services and Head of Quality and Regulatory Affairs at a company called Eightfold Governance. I've been working in quality and regulatory for medical devices for the last 5 years, and then in other industries prior to that. I've worked with companies entering the UK, EU, US, Canada, Asian markets, African markets, South American markets with medical devices, primarily software and in vitro diagnostic medical devices. And I've been working with AI medical devices for the last 4 years or so. I also sit on a standard committee that writes the software development lifecycle standard for medical devices as well. Eightfold Governance is a professional services company that helps healthcare innovators with compliance requirements, good governance requirements, things like information governance, information security, as well as medical device regulatory requirements. My agenda today, as Sam alluded to, is to give you an introduction to the what is software as a medical device and AI as a medical device, what is a medical device, and then an introduction to what the requirements are around medical devices, how they're regulated. I'll be focusing on the UK, EU, and US markets. There are a couple of mentions of other markets as we go through. We've got 5 sections. What is a medical device? An explanation of what software is a medical device and different versions of that concept are. The medical device regulatory frameworks in those territories. Standards, what a standard are, which ones might be applicable to medical devices, and how to implement a quality management system. And then finally, the technical file, working with external bodies such as notified bodies and approved bodies, how you get the products certified and how to release the products. We have about 2 hours in our agenda today, and like Sam mentioned, some of those are quite meaty topics, so we will cover them and we can answer some specific questions if we get them as we go as well. But it will not be an in-depth dive on any of these sections today. So first off, I'm going to talk about what is a medical device and give a brief history of the regulation of medical devices and where that comes from. The definition of a medical device varies depending on country and territory. So in the UK and the EU, there's a fairly similar definition of what a medical device is. These are some examples of the terms used in the regulations. Instruments, apparatus, appliances, software is specifically mentioned in there for the purpose of diagnosing, preventing, monitoring, predicting, providing a prognosis, treating. All those concepts are in the UK and the EU definition of medical devices, and that tends to be how they're defined in most territories. That doesn't mean that that is always the definition of a medical device, but these terms are a good starting point for determining what is a medical device and what it's for. I'm going to run through some examples. These are license-free images of medical devices because they were the best ones I could get hold of. Apologies for the image quality on some of these, but so you have a thermometer there, an in-ear thermometer, blood collection tube, a cuff for blood pressure measurements, a PCR machine for diagnostic testing, and even bigger instruments like a PET scanner or a CT scanner, and the software that you use to analyze that data related to the scanners. They're all common types of medical devices. So when you think about medical devices, these are the kinds of things that it means. So briefly, the background of why we have medical device regulations. There's a couple of very famous, if you're a medical device regulatory nerd, which I will admit to being, examples of medical devices that cause some really serious harm and that led to the medical device regulations that we have today. So this image here is a Dalcon Shield. It's an intrauterine contraceptive device that was created in the US by a company called A.H. Robbins in the 1960s and 70s. They continued to sell it into the 80s despite the very obvious issues that it had. It injured over 200,000 women in the US and killed at least 20. The record keeping wasn't great at the time. So how many died worldwide from this device is unclear. Possibly millions of people were harmed by this. and at least dozens were killed. It also led to multiple birth defects because of the way it was installed and the way that it functioned wasn't safe. Because of that, a number of companies, especially the US, where it was where they were headquartered, where they were based, there were no regulations in place. So when this harmful device entered the market, there was no mechanism for regulators to remove it. They didn't have the power to say that thing's not safe, take it off the market. So new regulations were created in the US, and that led to a wave of other regulations in the UK and European countries to regulate medical devices. If you look at what went wrong with the Dalcon Shield, from its design, its packaging, labeling, manufacturing processes, and then look at the medical device regulations in general, you will see a lot of alignment. A lot of the things that can go wrong with a medical device went wrong with the Dalcon Shield, and they used the issues that they'd had as the basis of the medical device regulations when they were written in the US, and then based on the model that the US had written into other countries' laws as well. In terms of software as a medical device, this image that we're looking at here is a Therac 25 that was developed in the 1980s by a Canadian company. They claimed that it was software driven. It's a radiation delivery instrument. They claimed that because the radiation delivery was controlled by software, it was impossible to deliver an overdose to patients. It wasn't quite true because they hadn't tested their software properly. So there are 6 known instances where radiation therapy was delivered at up to 100 times more than the patient should have received because of an issue in the software of the Therac 25. And this is what triggered the addition of software into the concept of a medical device. And again, the things that went wrong with the Therac 25 are the things that were initially written into the software requirements of medical device regulations. So the reason these regulations were created are things went wrong, and regulations were put in place to try and prevent that from happening again. A lot of the regulations and standards that are created are based on things that have gone wrong. And sometimes it's worth regulators think things might go wrong, but generally it's things that have gone wrong previously end up in regulations and standards. So if you're ever wondering why software is regulated as a medical device, you can thank the Atomic Energy of Canada company from the 1980s for that. We are through section 1. That was quite a fast section, that one, because it was just an introduction to what medical devices are. I'm going to talk briefly in this section about what the 3 types of software and AI medical devices are, and I'm going to talk about qualification and classification, and also describe what an intended purpose statement is and what it's for. Okay. So these 3 acronyms here, SaMD, SIMD, AIaMD, crop up a fair amount. Some of you will know what they are, some of you may not. So I thought it'd be worth explaining the 3 of them to kick off with. So software as a medical device is a piece of software that stands alone. It isn't integrated into another physical medical device and has a medical device function. So software used for diagnosing or treating or alleviating patients. Software for diagnosing, prognosing, identifying issues with patients that stands alone, runs on a desktop. It might run on a laptop. It might run on an iPad or an iPhone. That would be software as a medical device generally. Software in a medical device, SIMD, is where you have software built into a product that would be a medical device regardless. So if you're looking at, say, a diagnostic tool in a laboratory that's being used to test patient samples, and there's software in that, the software that sits within that medical device is part of the medical device. That's what you call software in a medical device. Artificial intelligence as a medical device is based on that SaMD concept, that software as a medical device. So AIaMD is when your software as a medical device incorporates AI into it. There are also AI AIaMDs, which is where you have AI incorporated into a physical medical device, but they're much rarer, and I haven't seen that acronym used yet. So it's not a commonly used acronym. Okay. So there are two pictures on this screen, but I'm imagining it with three examples. So the software that runs this PET scanner, this CT scanner, the software that moves the table in and out, that controls the amount of radiation being delivered to the patient, that will be software in a medical device. This image on the left of someone analyzing the dose to be delivered for radiation treatment of a patient, if that's running on a desktop, not a workstation built into the medical device, and it generally is running on a desktop, that will be software as a medical device. If you had a tool, and they tend not to use this for radiation planning, but if you had a tool that was through an AI algorithm automatically identifying, in this case, say, bone, white tissue, and gray tissue within this scan of a human head, that would be AI as a medical device, because that's where AI is working within a medical device software to deliver a medical device purpose. So software in a medical device, the physical object would be a medical device whether it had the software or not. Software as a medical device is sometimes called standalone software. It's software that works on its own, doesn't require a physical medical device to perform its medical function. And then AI as a medical device is software as a medical device with AI incorporated into it. There are two terms we use within medical device regulations to determine how a medical device is regulated. One is qualification and one is classification. Qualification asks the question, is this product a medical device or not? Does it fulfill the definition of a medical device within the regulation, within the territory that you're looking at? Qualification, almost all medical device regulations have different classes of medical devices, different risk levels, based on risk to the patient that it's being used on, and sometimes also risks to other patients who may come into contact with that patient. So if you're looking at diagnostics for communicable diseases, they are risk classed based on how communicable the disease is and how serious the disease is. So recently, for example, the EU downgraded COVID tests because the COVID is considered less serious of a condition. So COVID tests dropped in risk classification recently. So qualification, is it a medical device or not? Classification, what amount of regulation is applied to that medical device? How risky is it? And again, this is a country by country or territory by territory decision. So the qualification and classification in the UK might be different to the EU, might be different to the US. This is some guidance from the MHRA, which is the UK regulator of medical devices. This is a flowchart, and it's intended to describe to medical device manufacturers and to the regulator's own staff how you determine whether a piece of software is a medical device or not. You probably can't read that. I'm going to zoom in as much as I can fit on the screen, and hopefully that's a bit more readable. But this is this is a page, because there is a lot more detailed guidance on the MHRA of the current guidance on what is a medical device or not in the UK in terms of a software as a medical device. The question it asks there is to check what the intended purpose is. So what is the software intended to do? What is it intended to be used for? And I'll talk a little bit more about what intended purpose is further down and how to identify that. But you can see there are three routes out of that. So in your top right, you've got multi-purpose products, things like Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word, used in a medical environment, but are not medical devices. But there is an example there that you could use Microsoft Excel to make a medical device if you're building it with macros or functions or Visual Basic. But the general purpose product of Microsoft Excel isn't considered a medical device, even though you could build a medical device within Microsoft Excel. If it only has one of these functions in purple in the bottom right, then they consider it not a medical device. So things like educating patients about medical information, monitoring just fitness and well-being, not illness or disease or handicaps as they're described in the regulations. Educating professionals about medical devices, storing and transmitting data without change. So transmission of messages, emails, things like that between clinicians and patients. If it's just transmitting what was written by the clinician or the patient, it shouldn't be considered a medical device. Software used to book appointments, request prescriptions, used for virtual consultations, electronic patient records that simply replaces a paper file. None of those fall into medical devices. Reference information for healthcare professionals to search through, and databases without languages, macros, or scripting. All of them wouldn't be considered a medical device by the MHRA. On the other side, you will see some terms like those ones I had up earlier: prevention of disease, diagnosis of disease, monitoring of disease, treatment of diseases, injuries, handicaps, or provides information concerning a physiological or pathological state, concerning a congenital abnormality. They would consider them to have a medical purpose, and that will put you on the path to being considered a medical device by the MHRA in the UK. This is how the UK addresses this split. The EU has its own guidance. It's quite similar, but it has its own guidance on what is considered a medical device in the EU. The US has completely separate guidance on what is and is not a medical device. So there's a concept in the US of clinical decision support software that the US regulator, the FDA, have issued guidance on, based on some regulations that were released by the US Congress a few years ago, a decade or so ago, to limit in the US what is and is not considered a medical device in terms of software. So if you can say that these 4 tests are met for your medical device, for your software product, the FDA have said they do not consider that a medical device. Now, there is a long, again, everything I say today, I'm going to back up with, there is a long guidance document to take a look at related to this, because there always is a long guidance document or a couple of standards or other documents to refer to. But if you can meet those 4 criteria, the FDA don't consider you a medical device, whereas in the UK or the EU, if you were meeting these criteria, you probably would be considered a medical device. So it does vary by country, whether you're considered a medical device or not, and then also the specifics of the requirements around how you get approved and how you register that device. So I have an example here, and I've set up a poll, which hopefully we will get to work, Sam. I've got a description. Oh, it's come up. Brilliant. Do I get to answer as well? This is number 1. Is it a medical device? So this is a software app that's intended by the manufacturer. There's a description here I'll read out while you're voting if you like. Prevent STIs by allowing the exchange of information between different sexual partners. Permits the recording of STI results in order to share this information with the potential sexual partners within a network. During an encounter, these results are shared by scanning a QR code. The user then becomes part of the other users' networks. So this is an example that the MHRA gives. We've got a couple of answers coming through. I'm going to give it a sec. Oh, we're getting more no's now. Question 2 is a different medical device that I'm not showing on the screen yet. So if you're answering question 2, Sam, is there a way to clear the answers for question 2?
That's
going to be the next
yeah,
slide.
sorry, we thought it was easier to put both up at the same time, but yeah, let's see if we can clear those ones all.
Okay, plenty of answers there. Brilliant. So, based on that screen we were looking at a moment ago, this application stores or transmits medical data without change. It falls into that bottom right section, which means it wouldn't be considered a medical device. So even though it is intended to prevent sexually transmitted infections, it isn't doing anything other than storing or transmitting medical data between partners. So it falls into the non-medical device functionality there. So 21 of you got that one right, and 11 of you got that wrong. But these examples I'm going to give are all borderline cases, and they are not always clear immediately. I have a slightly trickier one next. Hopefully it's clear on the screen what this is. There is, those are teeth guards. So it's an electronic intraoral interface. So the intention is that you attach that to your teeth, and they're custom made for your teeth. There's a little pad there that sits on your palate, and you can use your tongue to control and interact with electronic devices. Do we think, and that, so this is question 2 now, do we think that would be a medical device or not?
We're just seeing if we can reset.
Oh, see if we can reset it first.
Okay, so question 2
I've
here.
managed to reset it.
Thank you.
can answer now.
So if you just answer question 2, not question 1. I think we might have to combine the answers, Daniel.
That's okay.
Some quick
well,
maths.
so my answer is again, I told you it was a tricky question, and I'm a tricky character. My answer is it depends. This device, when it was first talked about, was intended to be used, believe it or not, for gaming. So you would use it to substitute for a mouse or a keyboard, but not if you're disabled, just as an extra input. So you could use your tongue to control your character in a video game, as well as your keyboard or mouse or controller. In that instance, it would not be a medical device because it's not compensating for an injury or disability. However, obviously, if it was intended, and if it was intended to compensate for a disability or an injury, it would be a medical device. So everyone got the answer right. Well done, everyone. What that brings me to talk about is the concept of intended purpose. They call this an intended use in the United States. They just have a different term for a very similar concept.
Daniel, can I just ask a couple of questions that
Yeah,
I
of
think
course,
are relevant to that bit? So I'm reading out other people's questions here, but so someone asked, what if the software is linked to a hardware device?
So it depends how closely it's linked and what it's doing, but the concept of software as a medical device versus software in a medical device is a useful it's a useful tool, but it's not built into the regulation, so it doesn't change your classification. The regulatory approach is the concept of an accessory. So if there's a product or a piece of software that's intended to be used only with a medical device and it has a medical purpose, then it becomes an accessory to that medical device. Accessories are considered as medical devices, and then they can be classified based on their own function. So depending on what the software is doing with the physical medical device, it might be an accessory. If it is an accessory, it becomes a medical device, but then it can normally, accessories are classified as a lower classification than the medical device itself. You also have the option of saying that the medical device plus the software is a single system, a single medical device. You regulate it as a single product. So it depends how integrated they are, what their communication is. So, for example, a patient record system that receives data from a medical device and inputs it into a patient record system probably isn't, as it said further up, probably isn't exhibiting medical device functionality. But if you have, say, for example, a piece of software on a mobile phone app that's controlling or receiving data and displaying it to the patient from a implantable diabetes sensor, then that becomes part of the user interface of the medical device, and that ends up being regulated with the sensor.
So that would be a software as a medical device, what you've just explained there.
Yes, that last one would be software as a medical device. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting that. Thanks.
No, that's okay. It's fine.
I can't tell who said that. That's really weird.
No, I was trying to find that as well. But no, that's fine. Are currently statistical prognostic models or data-driven decision trees not technically AI as such? Would you class them as software as medical device or AI as medical device?
Data-driven decision trees. Would we class them as software as a medical device or AI as a medical device? So unfortunately, I'll give a similar answer to the last one. From a regulatory perspective, it doesn't matter a lot. Software as a medical device and AI, AI as a medical device is a type of software as a medical device. There is extra guidance for AI medical devices that might be helpful for companies making products like that, but they'd still be regulated as software as a medical device regardless. So whether you consider it AI or not, so if you consider it not AI, you can call it software as a medical device and regulate it as such. There might be AI guidance that's useful for that, but the definition of AI is not clear because or not been very well clarified because it doesn't matter. If it's software as a medical device, it's regulated, and you need to make sure it's safe and effective in the ways that any other medical device would be. I hope that answers that one.
Great. And last one, so Sashi's just asking about simple calculations. So e.g. commonly used calculations that clinicians could calculate themselves with the data available on the system. So she's e.g. dialysis adequacy. So I assume the question is, if something's doing that, does it become a medical device?
I'm going to need to refer back to some guidance that has only come out in the last couple of months. It depends how, the answer is it depends how simple that calculation is. If I'm remembering correctly, and in our break in a few minutes, I'll go and double check on this. If I'm remembering correctly, the guidance says if you would need a calculator to do it, then it's not simple enough. If you can do it in your head, and there is a suggestion of how you figure out whether someone would need a calculator or not through a study. If I'm remembering correctly, and again, if I'm wrong, I will come back after the break and let you know the answer. But if it's complicated enough to need a calculator to do it, then it's not simple enough to be considered not a medical device in a calculation like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. I'll let you carry on.
I'm just going to take a note so that I go check that in the break, because if I've misremembered that 50-odd page guideline, I'll be very embarrassed, but I will correct it.
It's all right, no one saw. It's not like everyone's watching. So
It's not like you're recording this for
No,
posterity
exactly.
or anything, Sam. Don't worry about it. So this brings me on to the concept of intended purpose, which is called intended use in the US. So questions like, what is it intended to achieve? The MHRA calls the description of that structure and function. For who? So what intended population of patients or service users is this software intended for, or is this product intended for? Who's intended to use it, and where and when are they intended to use it? All of these concepts fall into the intended purpose. Sometimes it's called a use specification, sometimes it's called an intended use, but the idea of what this product is for, what this software is for. And what the MHRA says, and what most regulators say about what the intended purpose of a product is the company should write down what the intended purpose of a product is. And if you're registering with the MHRA, that's one of the requirements, that you have written down what the intended purpose of the product is. But that's not the only way in which the MHRA and regulators and patients and clinicians will consider the intended purpose of your medical device. If you state or imply that a software is capable of or intended for use in a different way than what you've written down, could be in adverts, could be in your app store description, could be in the landing page for the application or for your website, could be something you said in social media, could be a quote from a clinician that you've shared on social media, even though it's not you that's saying it. If you're quoting someone who's saying it, that your product does something, that's you making a claim about the product as part of its intended purpose. It could be in the labels, it could be in the instructions, it could be in the way that the thing works, that it is implicit what it is that the software is intended to do. It could be that the users have misinterpreted what you've told them, and they've taken a different purpose for the software. Another thing to point out, what you can't do is state or imply in adverts or in the way that the system works or through quotes and testimonials, and then write down in the software, this is not a medical device. Do not use it as a medical device. If you've stated or implied that it has medical device functionality and then just disclaim on the product, don't do this isn't for this purpose, that's not a get out of jail free card for it. They don't accept disclaimers on medical device functionality. If you've said or stated or implied or referenced the ability to perform a medical function, your intended purpose is as a medical device. So this is an example. This is from some the guidance that I mentioned earlier that the MHRA released about digital mental health technologies a few months ago. So you're a company that runs an online forum, and it's for people with depression, clinical depression. That's the way that you phrase it. You know from your own evidence that the forum reduces the frequency of depressive episodes by 10%. And again, I'm just making things up here, so that that might not be the way in which it's measured, but let's just say this is the data you have. If you're an online forum for that purpose and you reduce depressive episodes by 10%, and if you ignore that third bullet point there, because I'm going to come to that in a second, you're just providing simple forum functionality, then you're just transferring data between users. You would not be considered a medical device, even though you've talked about this ability to reduce depressive episodes by 10%. If you then add in a functionality for filtering out content for users based on what might trigger them, you become a medical device because of the combination of a clinical level condition for the users, the claim that you're reducing depressive episodes, as in you're making a medical claim about the forum, and you're providing a level of functionality that makes you fall into a medical device category. So again, this is based on a couple of months, 3 months ago now, I think it was February, 4 months, February, isn't it? They released a digital mental health technology guidance. It has implications within it. So the scope of the guidance that the MHRA released a few months ago is only digital mental health technology. But the way in which it talks about different functionality, we would assume would apply to any software as a medical device. And you would expect that if you would be expected to apply similar logic to your device. So the other interesting idea here is that guidance that may not appear to apply to your product can provide information that you might not have expected it to. And I'd especially say the digital mental health technology guidance that the MHRA released a few months ago is probably relevant to anyone making software as a medical device and indicates what I hope the MHRA will soon be releasing as a new guidance on digital technologies in general and which are considered medical devices. I'm going to put myself on the spot again, Sam. Does anyone want to describe a product, and I'll try and tell them if I think it's a medical device or not? If you want to, I guess, put your hands up, Sam. Will hands up?
Yeah, I
function
think
work?
there's a hand
Yeah.
up. Yeah. Any takers? Either everyone's very clear or no one
I've thoroughly informed them,
Yeah,
and there's
yeah,
no questions left.
I've got. Sorry, I can't put my hand up. So I'm on my
There you go, Kevin. Yeah, go for it.
Another question.
Oh, I don't think it's.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear someone. I just don't think it's Kevin.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
I got Kevin flipped up there. We can hear whoever's speaking. Do you want to go for it? I can't quite see who it is.
Yeah, sorry, I'm clinical, so I'm just sort of jotting in and out. If you have a AI software that is able to aid in clinical decision making, is that considered as a medical device? And I have a part B question to that.
Generally, yes. If it's supporting clinical decision making, it's generally considered a medical device. There are exemptions in that guidance around providing relevant clinical information to clinicians, but if the clinician is using it as the base or even partially as the basis of their decision in terms of what needs to happen to a patient, then it would fall into medical device territory there.
That's really clear. Thank you so much. I was just going through the MHRA slide that you were saying, because I think it said software that provide reference information to make healthcare professionals to use their knowledge to make a clinical decision. So it's quite vague, actually, in terms of the line. So if you as a company decide and say this is not to be used for clinical decision making, but then the AI is used then to make clinical decision, then there is no liability in that regards. Is that correct to say? And
so that comes back to the idea of intended purpose. So if you say this isn't what it's intended for, but if by the way it works, it's implicit that it is what it's intended for, then you could still be you should have assumed it was a medical device in that scenario. The other one is if you find out as part of feedback from users that that's what they're using it for, you need to consider whether you've done that or not. Accidentally or not, you may have created a medical device that gives, a piece of software that gives the impression to its users that it's intended for that purpose. So you'd need to keep an eye on feedback from users about what they're using it for and when they're using it as well, to make sure you don't fall into that category.
And does it classification?
Okay, so
Sorry, Kevin, this is back on yours because mine's is kind of similar. On the back of that, does it make a difference in the classification if they're just using it to make a decision as a software, as a medical device? Does it go into classifications then? How do we classify that particular piece of software that's just interpreting information and giving it to the clinicians?
So that's also in that guidance. It talks about how to classify it, but it depends on how reliant the clinician is on that information. So if the software is giving you this, I think this patient has this condition, or I have an 80%, the software considers this patient has an 80% chance of having this condition, then it would be and depending on how serious the condition is, it will be a higher classification than something that gives general feedback about a patient or general information to the clinician. So yeah, how reliant the clinician is on that software will drive a different classification. And I've got some more slides on classification further down as well.
Daniel, that's really, really helpful. Thank you so much for that. The reason why I was asking all this is because I really want to protect clinicians. So I just want to make sure that the regulation is really strict on this. And I'm just going to explore this further, just to make sure that any AI device that, even with its intent or not intent purposes, if it's in some way or shape or form has the ability to help clinicians make decisions, I just want to make sure that the clinicians are protected and well heard, that if they're using it, then the full responsibility should be put back on AI software companies or companies in general. And I wonder whether you have explored or you're going to talk about liability.
So I don't have any slides about liability specifically, but we do hear a lot from clinicians dealing with the NHS standard for clinical safety, DCB 0129 and DCB 0160, about how they are concerned that the clinical safety officers, so that's the staff within medical service providing organizations that review this software and determine its safety and its classification, whether they have the knowledge or whether they have the information from the manufacturers to make decisions about how safe they are or not. Liability generally within medical devices falls on the manufacturer as long as you are a medical device. But how much of that is enforced through regulation versus through civil cases, it tends to be more in a civil case scenario. If you can't show that you met the requirements of medical device safety and effectiveness, that's when you tend to suffer liability rather than, and you were negligent in doing that is when you tend to find liability falling to manufacturers.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, Sam. I can see multiple hands. I've probably only got time for one more before we have to move on. I don't know how to pick.
That's fine. Well, I'll go Kevin because I think it was the first, but also just to say next week's session will focus on statement of intended use and device classification. So we've also got some time to spend next week, and also questions around responsibility, particularly around AI, we will cover later as well. So there is another opportunity to kind of go into this. So I'll let Kevin go as he was the first up. Laura, I don't know if yours was a question or if you were also offering to suggest yours.
No, I was going to suggest ours. I mean, we're making the assumption that we're a class 2B and we're digital mental health. So very relevant to what you just said. The problem is there's a therapeutic effect because we're meeting an unmet patient need. And yeah, the therapeutic effect has, well, it's about a 10%, we estimate, improvement in outcomes as a result, and maybe even bigger impact in terms of shorter treatment cycles. We've just presumed we're a class 2B. We could theoretically call ourselves a class 1, but the odds are, because we don't know how people are going to use it, we're assuming it's going to end up there, whether or not, that's what we started. I mean, is that a valid strategy?
I'd say you might want to run some, they're called formative usability evaluations in the standards and regulations, but you might want to put the software in front of some real users and ask them what they'd use it for. If you can show through, so formative is a test to see what you're getting. Summative is a confirmation of an assumption. But if you could show through a formative and summative usability evaluation that they don't use it for those purposes that you think might be class 2B, you might save yourself a lot of hassle. So it might be worth putting it in front of patients or users and seeing what they intend to do with it and what they want to do with it. And if you find that 97% of them don't want to use the functionality that would make you class 2B, you could perhaps take a little bit of stuff out, still fulfill 97% of the need, and then work towards getting that extra functionality certified, so you could release and have that positive impact on patients and users sooner.
I'd love to be able to do that, but one of the problems of mental health is, to quote the foremost researcher, we don't know what a mental health problem is. So we don't have that ground zero truth that you have in physiological health.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I suppose we're taking a very cautious approach because we think, we don't know how clinicians and users will use it, but there is a very strong likelihood they will end up basing clinical decisions on what this thing does.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. I'm going to, we are at just about 1:15, which is when we intended to take a break. So I'm going to jump to the break now. And I'm going to come back and talk about classification in about 10 minutes. So if everyone would like to have a little break for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back at 25 past. Fab. So I'm going to talk through in section 3 an overview of some of the medical device regulations, the UK, the EU, and the US, and what the AIaMD is and what the world outside of those 3 countries and territories do. So generally, medical device regulations, I like to think of them in terms of these 4 areas. So you've got quality management system. Quality management system is a way of managing your business, a set of processes and procedures for managing your business to try and meet the aims of the medical device regulations, which is safe and effective medical devices. But that applies to, and we'll talk a little more detail about this later, but your suppliers, your infrastructure that you're basing your software in, how you know your staff know what to do, and how you know your staff are competent in their roles. The quality management system is much more all-encompassing than just design and development, but it also includes design and development of the software that you're making, or your medical device that you're making, and also how it's released or how it's produced if it's a physical medical device or something that incorporates software. Technical documentation is a set of documents, and I do mean documents because it is documents that you're talking about. It is generally a combination of Word documents and Excel documents. It can be PDFs. Because you're going to have to share this with an external party, in most instances, you need to be able to export it in a way that they can read. You're going to be making a big PDF if you're working with a regulator with technical documentation. That's the documents that the team that are developing the product, that's not just your software development team, that's clinical, product managers, risk managers, all those kinds of people would be involved in. But that's the documentation that shows how you develop the product, why you think it's going to work, and how you've mitigated risk for that product. Conformity assessment is then the methodology through which your product is confirmed as meeting the requirements of the standard, of the regulations. That's different depending on your classification, depending on your territory. Registration is then how you tell the regulator that that product is on the market. And reporting is how you tell that regulator when things go wrong with your product, when your product may have been involved in harming someone. There are requirements for reporting that to the regulator as well. We'll talk about each of these 4 in more detail as we go through these slides, but generally you will find these 4 or 5 concepts within any medical device regulation that you look at. Sorry, they were supposed to skip there. Makes me worry I need to refresh my page actually. So these 3 territories here, you've got covering mainly the UK, the EU, and the US. The regulations, they're called medical device regulations, or in the US, it's the Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act and 21 CFR Part 820, which is the quality system regulation. In the UK, you have you have 4 different classifications. Class 1 in the UK means you can self-certify, which means that you don't have to have any approval from an external party to release a Class 1 medical device onto the UK market. If you're at 2A, 2B, or 3, you need to engage with an approved body. The UK also accepts an approval from an EU notified body. So that's an external body that approves your technical file and your quality management system to confirm that you've got a safe and effective medical device. In the EU, because of the way that the medical device regulations are written, the latest 2017 medical device regulation is written, and the guidance that have been released in the EU, there isn't a route for self-certification for software as a medical device in the EU like there is in the UK. So there really isn't a self-certification route for medical device software as a medical device in the EU. All of it needs to go through what they call a notified body, so an approval body for reviewing that quality management system technical file. The US has 3 classes of medical devices. So class 1, which generally can be self-certified. Class 2, which generally, because again, there are different exemptions for different types of software and different types of products in the US. Class 2 generally needs to go through an approval pathway with the FDA or an external body, and then Class 3 tends to go through an approval pathway with the FDA themselves, the regulator in the US. The UK and the EU recognise a standard called ISO 13485 for the quality management system. The US has their own standard, although they're aligning with ISO 13485 next year. The UK and the US, most users that you're looking for, or it's generally accepted that if your interface and your documentation is in English, then you should be fine. In the EU, your documentation is going to depend, or the language of your documentation is going to depend on who you're working with in the EU and whether they accept English. Many of them do, some of them don't. So there is a chat, you need to pick your notified body in the EU, and they need to pick their competent authority, which is the regulator within an EU country. Whether they speak a language that you and your company can speak is an important consideration as well. And similarly, the users in the EU will expect different languages depending on what country you're in. So I think, for example, in Germany, if it's a healthcare professional using it, your interface can be in English, but if it's not a healthcare professional using it, you need a German user interface for your software. There's a link there to a list that the EU have released of what languages they expect in which countries. Fees vary depending on your approval route. So obviously if you're self-certifying, then there's no approval fees involved. There's a registration fee with the MHRA, which is about £300 at the moment, I believe. And I think that's going to be per annum going forward. If you're working with an approved or notified body, you're looking, and it's a class 2A, for example, you're looking at fees in the range of £70,000 to £100,000 upfront. That's the kind of fee you tend to see an approved or notified body charging to certify one software medical device with the company that they're with. It's worth knowing that upfront in terms of deciding what markets you want to go to and when. In the US, the approval fees, if you need to get approved, so if you're class 2 or above, vary depending on what class you are. They vary from the cheapest approval route is $6,000, and the most expensive approval route is $500,000. So it's quite a wide range there. So it's really worth taking a look at which route you need to go through for each market to determine how much just approval costs you will incur from regulators. They also will each have data protection laws. So there's Data Protection Act and GDPR in the UK. The EU has GDPR, and then individual countries have their own implementations of that. And the US has a health data protection act called HIPAA, Health Insurance Protection and Accountability Act, they call it. These are broadly the rules for risk classification in each country. In the UK, there are 18 rules and only 4 of them apply to software as a medical device in terms of which risk classification you would be. The EU, there are 22 rules, 5 of which could apply to software as a medical device. In the US, there are 1,700 rules. So the US classify things by what the product is, and they have 1,700 different types of product that you could apply to be classified under. So the US rule decision is a bit more complicated than it is in the EU and the UK. In the UK, most software as medical devices fall into class 1, and that allows for self-certification, whereas in the EU, basically no software as a medical device falls into class 1. So it's not simple or possible to self-certify a software medical device in the EU. In the US, the lowest risk, the class 1 medical devices are self-certified. You have to apply what they call general. Oh, sorry, they're not self-certified. You have to apply general controls, and depending on the product type, you may have to apply for a 510K, which is a mechanism that you can get approval in the US through. Class 2A in the UK are software products that image radiopharmaceuticals. They allow for direct diagnosis of a patient, and the definition of direct diagnosis is in that guidance that I've sent through, because you should read that if you think it might be applicable, because it's quite broad. Monitoring of physiological data, they fall into class 2A. Class 2A in the EU has quite a few different definitions, but generally they're the lower risk software medical devices. In the class 2B in the UK is for monitoring vital physiological parameters, and the EU defines it as software that could cause serious deterioration of the health of the patient. Class 3 in the UK, you can't be class 3 if you're a software medical device in the UK. The rules don't allow for it. Class 2B is as high as you can get. In the EU, if your software could cause death or irreversible deterioration of the patient, you'd fall into class 3. I am overly simplifying these rules. There are a lot of guidance and information about how you apply these rules in the EU and the UK. And in the US, each of those 1,700 classifications has a description of what that product is and what it needs to do. There are also different classifications for in vitro diagnostic medical devices, so things that are looking at blood or looking at tissue samples taken from patients and then analysed away from that patient. The UK has general, self-test, list A and list B, and there are 11 rules which are specific tests that fall into list A and list B, which are the highest classifications. The EU has standardised that into A, B, C and D, and there are 7 rules defining which one you fall into. The US doesn't make any distinction for in vitro diagnostics, so they're treated the same as other medical devices. But in the UK and the EU, it's worth noting that in vitro diagnostic medical devices are a separate class of medical device with a separate set of regulations. Similar regulations, but different. It's a different document with specific different requirements to standalone medical devices. Outside of the UK and the EU, almost every country has some kind of medical device regulation. It varies how long and complicated it is depending on the country. Many countries use what are called reliance and recognition frameworks, which is different mechanisms of either completely or partially accepting a medical device because it's approved on another market. So for example, the Australian regulatory agency will recognise products that have been approved in the EU for a much shorter approval process to access the Australian market. And in fact, the UK recognises all products that have been released on the EU market for the UK market as well. There is an organisation called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which is intended to align regulators with each other. And the EU medical device regulations are pretty much the same as the suggestion from the International Medical Device Regulators Forum as to what a medical device should look like. So the EU medical device regulations are a template that many countries have copied or are in the process of implementing a copy of. The US...
No, carry on. You were just coming on to it, the US one.
The US have their own approach. So the US are a member of AIaMDRF, but they don't align with the AIaMDRF approach for regulations. So where I'm talking about 7 rules in the EU versus 1,700 rules in the US, they just have a different approach for how they regulate their products. You will find that most countries will either have like an EU-aligned style of medical device regulation, or will have a US-aligned style of medical device regulation. China do their own thing. I just mentioned that very briefly. China can get quite complicated.
Okay, if you're going through the FDA US route, there a drastic differential in what you need to produce documentation-wise, classification 2A or 2B, for example?
I don't think so. The way that they want the documents titled is different, but the content of the documents tends to be very similar. The distinction that I'd make between the EU and the US is if you're going through the 510K application process, the US don't need to see very much clinical evidence. They need to see that you are substantially equivalent to an existing product that's available on the US market. Whereas in the EU, all medical devices that go through approval require clinical evidence to support them. That's the biggest distinction, I'd say, between the two systems.
Thank you so much.
It's okay.
Really helpful, actually, thank you.
So key areas to consider if you're looking at different countries, different territories, the language you need to communicate in both to your users and to regulators. So there are some regulators that will not communicate in English. You will need a translator, or you will need to have someone on staff who can deal with that, or someone based in the country who can help you with it. Whether your clinical evidence is applicable to that region. So based on the demographics of the region or the way the healthcare system works, your clinical evidence may not be valid for that country that you're trying to apply to if you've taken it from a country that is very different in terms of demographics or healthcare systems. Local representatives are many countries, the UK require it, the EU require it, the US require it. If you are not based in that country, there needs to be someone, and there are companies that deliver this as a service, someone based in that country who can act on your behalf with that regulator. So if an EU-based company wants to come to the UK market, they need to have a UK responsible person, it can be a person, it's generally a company because of liability questions, a company that holds a copy of their technical documentation. And if the MHRA wants to ask a question of that company, they contact the responsible person rather than the company directly. My understanding of the reason for that is in a very extreme circumstance, if the MHRA ever needed to kick down someone's door and seize some documents, it better be within UK's jurisdiction. So they want someone in the UK whose door they can kick down and take the documents from. Not that that ever happens, but if it ever needed to, there would be someone in the UK to summon. Registration and reporting tends to vary. It tends to be the area that varies most between countries. So the administrative process by which you tell the regulator the product is now on the market is different databases, different web addresses, different places to keep registered, different update frequencies, different fees for updating. And the requirements for reporting incidents where your medical device might have been involved in harming someone are quite different in different countries. So for example, in Canada, if a product that's on the Canadian market harms someone outside of Canada, they want to know. But in the EU, if a product that's on the EU market harms someone outside of the EU, they don't want to know. That varies, and there's 100 different ways in which those reporting criteria vary between different countries as well. I'm going to talk about standards, NHS requirements, and how you'd implement a quality management system. So a standard is a document that is attempting to define best practice in whatever the title of the document is. I'll go through a number of examples in a minute, but the idea behind a standard is here's best practice in this area, so we can all share it. They're drafted and edited by volunteers from industry. I mentioned earlier that I'm a member of a few technical committees for the International Electrotechnical Commission, so I help with drafting and editing the standard about software development lifecycle, for example. It's called IEC 62304. So we're working on a new version of that, and we're trying to update it with updated to best practice incorporation of AI requirements, for example, into how you develop a software medical device. But it's almost entirely volunteers from within the industry. There are two main organizations that make these standards. There are a number of other organizations that might be relevant depending on what industry, what type of product, but there's the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. Yes, those letters don't make sense. They're not in the right order. That's deliberate. The International Electrotechnical Commission tends to focus on electrical and electronic and software related products, whereas the International Organization for Standardization focuses on any product and any sort of company. So these organizations create standards, and then regulators will, there's different terms for this again in different countries, but adopt, recognize, harmonize standards to say this is a good way to deliver the medical device regulatory requirements or the low voltage directive requirements or any other regulation. The regulator will say these are good ways of doing that. So what is in a standard? I've taken an example of probably the most commonly used medical device standard, which is ISO 13485. It is the standard for medical device quality management systems. So comparatively, the medical device regulations in the UK are about 110 pages long. ISO 13485 is 82 pages long. ISO 13485 is not the only standard that you will need to apply for UK medical device regulations. So that multiplies across multiple standards. There are 8 pages of introductions and contents pages, 6 pages of scope and definitions, and then you get into the actual requirements of the document. 4 pages describing how your management system should be set up, 2 on management responsibility, 2 on HR and your company's infrastructure, 8 pages to cover how you deal with your customers, how you design and develop your product, how you create your product, and how you deal with your suppliers. Pretty central, important things for a company to do. 5 pages about setting objectives and KPIs, dealing with complaints, auditing and improving your management system. And then there are 42 pages of annexes and bibliography. And the majority of the annex in ISO 13485 is a comparison between the UK and EU medical device regulations and the standard, which can be very helpful, but takes up a lot of space. So when you open a document and see it's 82 pages long and it's a standard, please be aware that at least half of that is probably going to be maybe helpful in very specific scenarios, and probably less than half of that is going to be proper content. This is what it looks like. This is the cover page of the copy of ISO 13485 that I have. It's from the Estonian Standards Agency, so I get the Estonian title and then the English title. They are licensed to either companies or to individuals, depending on who you buy it from. And standards agencies are very protective of their intellectual property. If you ever have an auditor from a standards agency, like the British Standards Institute, they will check whether you are using their standards properly and give you a non-conformity if you're sharing them in a way you shouldn't. These are standards that I think apply to pretty much all software medical devices. There are hundreds, thousands of other standards that might apply to specific medical device products, but these are ones that are broadly useful. So 13485 is about how to set up your quality management system. 14971, risk management system. 20416, post-market surveillance, so how you monitor how your product is, if your product is being safe and effective after you've released it. IEC 62304 for software development. 62366 for how you define your user interface and make sure that your user interface is safe. 20417 is how you create instructions and labels for your product. And 15223, I'm going to admit something quite nerdy here. That's my favorite standard, that one. It's a series of symbols and what they mean. And it means that when you're trying to translate documents into other languages, instead of translating text, you can use a universally recognized symbol. I quite like being able to do that. It saves a lot of translation time sometimes. So yeah, a set of symbols that are generally considered to be recognized internationally that you can use on your product rather than text that you need to translate. Things like hazardous warning, or this is the name of the company you made it, that kind of stuff. There are different versions of standards depending on what country you're in, and they apply in different ways. BS means British Standard, EN means European Norm. The number at the end means the year in which it was released. So ISO 13485 2016 was released in 2016. British Standard European Norm ISO 13485 2016 was released in 2016 as well, and is the same as ISO 13485. British Standard European Norm ISO Standard 13485 2016 was updated in 2021 with version 11. Each of these bits of text and numbers means something slightly different, and each regulator will specify exactly which version it is that they are recognizing. It's worth being aware of that as well. I'm going to speak briefly about NHS requirements for medical devices. So there's a system called DTAC, which is the Digital Technology Assessment Criteria. The idea is that it gathers all of the NHS requirements for digital technology into a single place. It covers procurement, so what information the procurement teams within the NHS want. It covers information governance, data protection, confidentiality. It covers clinical safety, which is risk management of the product. And it covers things like IT integrations with other systems, proving that your system can integrate with other systems that it needs to. It is a number of pages long checklist that during NHS procurement they will expect you to provide to them, and then keep up to date with new versions of software. Some of the requirements of DTAC will align with medical device standard requirements, and you can just use what you've got and drop it straight into DTAC. Some of them are quite different, but it's worth being aware as well at the end. Just because you're registered and approved as a medical device, that's a few checklists for the NHS. There are others around how your company needs to operate that need to be addressed as well. So I mentioned earlier quality management system. These are some key areas within a quality management system, but the idea of a quality management system is that it covers most, probably all of a company. It depends on how big of a company it is, but it's going to apply to HR, it's going to apply to sales and marketing for them making claims about the product and which product they sell to which customer. It's going to apply to finance for when they're invoicing customers. It's going to apply to IT for your infrastructure and the tools that people are using to make that software. It's going to apply to your suppliers and how you purchase things. It's quite wide ranging, and people are quite surprised by that. They tend to think it only covers the design and development of the product, but it doesn't. It has a much wider scope than that. I've massively simplified how you would do this, and then there's some more guidance on that, but in the next few slides. But you would set up a policy, which is a statement about what you want to achieve through developing this management system, and what objectives, things like customer complaints, number of bugs, how well people are keeping on top of their training. They're all wanting to achieve certification to a particular standard or regulation. They're all objectives that you might set for your management system. A key step that we find at Eightfold when we're helping people implement quality management systems is clearly assigning responsibilities. So saying these are the things we need to do, who's going to do them? We tend to assign that to job roles or job titles rather than individual people so that they can be shuffled around more easily. But saying who is going to cover what and what needs to be done is always step one when we're implementing a management system. And I really recommend carefully considering that when you're doing it. You then set up procedures. So these are documents that define how you will do those things that you need to do. So you draft a procedure, see if it works, make any fixes, train everyone in how to do it, set up any systems you need to support the procedure, and then set someone who is responsible for that procedure is going to maintain it, make sure it keeps working over time as changes are made within the business, that those procedures still make sense for new members of staff coming in. And then once all those procedures are trained and implemented, you have to do an audit. So someone who's independent of those processes has to come in and check that they're working in the way they're supposed to and you're meeting your requirements and your objectives. And then as a management team, a senior management team of a business, review that management system to see if it's performing in the way it's expected. All of this is covered in ISO 13485, what the requirements are. Things that tend to go wrong, trying to do it without having all the guidance that you should. So there are a lot of documents that explain how ISO 13485 works. It's sometimes useful to have someone just advising on the detail and things that can go wrong and will go wrong, and just having a bit of advice on doing it can be helpful. I mentioned assigning responsibilities previously, so understanding who is going to take responsibility for what and making sure they understand that as well, key to making it work. Setting up too many documents is a common problem. So I once worked at a company that had 150 procedures. And then when people started, they were expected to read 80 odd documents to see what they said. It's too many. The more documents you have, the more unwieldy it gets. I prefer the fewest number of documents you can get. Not aligning your procedures with what you're doing at the moment. So it can be really useful. You may have to tweak what you're doing at the moment in some instances. But again, quality management systems are intended to be best practice. You're probably doing a lot of it already. The biggest thing we find is people just aren't writing it down. And the big requirement within a management system is you must have a record of something happening. So if you can switch from this is the way we do it to, okay, we've written down how we do it and we're going to keep a record, preferably an automated record rather than a manual record of what we did, that's a lot easier than starting again from scratch most of the time. And then having a schedule of activities for things that don't happen every day or every week or every month, just as a reminder to yourself that you check monthly, or this month we need to audit that process, or this month the auditor's coming in, we better be ready for that. The areas that tend to take the most time in implementing document management, so setting up a system that meets the requirements of the regulators for recording your documents. There are a number of good tools for that. We tend to use Confluence with a few add-ons, but there are a number of other systems that will deal with document management. It depends which territories you're going in, because there are slightly different requirements for different territories. Setting up a training system so that you can record when people have reviewed documents is an important section that tends to take a bit of time as well. With software medical devices, suppliers tend to not be as big of a problem because you can deal with people who supply you with code or software pieces as part of your development process rather than as a supplier evaluation. But if you have external developers, that's something you need to assess whether they're delivering what you expect them to and how you will on an ongoing basis know that they're delivering what you want them to. Establishing what your infrastructure is and how you can confirm that it's working in the way you expect it to and what it needs to support your medical device, and making sure you're keeping control over your marketing function in terms of what claims they're making about the product. So when we talked earlier about intended purpose, having a mechanism in place so that the marketing team or whatever equivalent you have understand what claims they can and cannot make about a product. And for example, if a doctor makes a claim about a product and they share it on LinkedIn, they've suddenly made a new claim about the product. That is an issue that can come up as well. Skip through that. In terms of setting up your processes and your procedures, I mentioned earlier about documentation. I recommend having as few as possible. As a company, the fewer you probably only have about 20 to 25 processes that are relevant to the management system, and it's things like training, product development, risk management, infrastructure, suppliers, non-conformities, what to do when things go wrong, how you speak to your customers. The fewer procedures you have, the easier it tends to be to manage a management system. And what I find is lots of management systems get out of hand when you break down processes into multiple procedures. So you end up with 6 or 7 documents defining how you do product development, and someone has to read through every single one of them when you could provide a single document and not be as prescriptive within the procedure about what they need to do. Procedures should assign responsibilities and what order of activities happen. And then your guidance, you should try and embed in whatever tools you're using or whatever templates you're using. So if you're doing a supplier evaluation, don't write it all in the procedure because no one will read the procedure. Write it in the form you're going to use to fill in, or the JIRA board that you're going to use to fill in your supplier evaluations. 25 procedures is probably the maximum you would want. There might be a few more if you're doing extra management systems like ISO 27001 or ISO 42001, but that would be my recommendation in terms of setting up your processes. Auditing, so your audit should be based on the risks that you've identified in your processes. So whether that's how much impact that process has on your medical device, so something like design and development probably gets audited more often than HR. But also how often you find problems. So being able to show that you are looking at where you're having problems and also looking objectively at where the most risk is to determine how often you're reviewing a process is a good way to set up your internal audit schedule. The idea behind audits is not that you're looking to just tick boxes, it's to look for improvements and genuine improvements. And improvements are sometimes removing things. They don't always have to be adding more requirements. It's a good thing to consider when you're doing an internal audit. A lot of auditors will try and add new things. Are there ways to simplify that you could identify as well? Person who performs audits needs to be competent in auditing. They need to know about your business and about your products, and they need to be independent of whatever they're auditing. That can be quite difficult in a small company. Sometimes people use external auditors or external consultants to come in and do audits. but you can establish some level of independence within a team of even 4 or 5 people normally. And then management review, like I mentioned earlier, is the senior management team having oversight of the quality management system. Process owners report data about how the management system is working to that team, and they get to make decisions about how to make improvements. I'm going to take a breath real quick. Is there any questions at the moment, Sam?
There's a few questions, yeah.
Mm.
I'm just sort of thinking how to cherry pick them. Any sort of advice on backdating or standardizing documents, especially with lots written in different places, Google Drive, Notion, WhatsApp, Slack?
Grab them, put them into whatever you document, grab them all together. What, you know, if you've got them in 4 different places and here's the software requirements for the software, for example. Put them onto a Word document or a Confluence page all together and sign off that page. I generally wouldn't recommend trying to standardize the format and content of all of your old documents if you've got a lot of them. I'd generally recommend trying to bundle them together. The only exception I'd make there is if you're using another tool. So in the example of requirements, if you're now tracking them in Jira and you want to use Jira's traceability and linking functionality, drop them into Jira. But yeah, generally, I've found trying to bring all the documents into your new format is fighting a losing battle. You're better to embed it into a new document, sign it all off, and keep it there.
Great. Couple of, I think, quickish ones. Fees that you mentioned. Sorry, some of these are going back through some of the previous sections, but fees, a one-off payment? Question mark.
Nope. So that 70 to 100 grand is the initial payment. You also pay for an annual audit. So you pay, depends on the size of the company, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds a year for your audit. You will have an unannounced audit at least once every 5 years from a notified body or an approved body. Again, you'll pay a similar amount. There'll be certification fees each year, which tend to be about £1,000 a year, something like that. And then when you want to make a significant change, which I'll talk about in a minute what that means, you'll need to get your product reapproved. And that won't cost as much as the initial approval, but it depends on how big of a change you're making to the product. But they will charge the same hourly rate. It will be fewer hours based on your change. But yeah, it's not one-off. And then every 3 years, you have a recertification audit, which is more expensive than a normal surveillance audit. So no, unfortunately, not one-off, ongoing.
Lisa's just said Confluence, she was advised not useful as it has no version control.
Confluence itself does.
My QA is point blank refusing for anything to be put on Confluence, as she's advising there's no version control and no version control numbering on it for the documentation.
So native Confluence, that's true. There are add-ons you can add into Confluence that you can use to add that version control and approval in. There's a few of them, but look for 21 CFR Part 11 as your search criteria. I'll write that in the chat because that covers the US market because they have specific document approval requirements as well.
Thank you.
And I'll maybe just put one more to you, if that's okay. Just to comment on sort of scaling from class 1 to the higher classes. Mm-hmm. How difficult is that?
So the requirements between class 1 and class 2A or class 2B, the regulatory requirements are very similar. In terms of your management system and your technical file, they should be pretty similar. If you set up properly for class 1 and you haven't sort of skipped steps or ignored some of the requirements, it shouldn't be a problem. Other than the cost and time and effort that goes into dealing with a notified body or approved body. What companies tend to find is if they've skipped steps or ignored requirements or not done their class 1 conformity assessment properly, the notified bodies will come in and do their audit, and that's when they'll have problems because they'll have fundamental process issues that they'll need to address because they skipped things that were required at class 1 that they shouldn't have done. Dealing with a notified body or an approved body, they are very backlogged, so they're very slow to answer any questions and they're very expensive. So it takes a lot of time and mental energy to keep working with them sometimes. But the changes to the management system and the technical file, as long as you've done your class 1 properly, shouldn't be massively different for a class 2A.
Excellent. There's some more, but I can come back to them at the end if we've got time.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to rattle through section 5 now. I'm very aware that you have 2 sessions on technical file, so I'm going to cover that very briefly. So we're now into this idea of creating and collating a technical file, which is what your product development process is intended to do. Cross-functional teams are critical, so you need developers, you need testers. They might be the same person. You need someone who's managing what the product is. You need medical or clinical information. You need someone with an idea of the quality and regulatory requirements, all involved in the development of the product. There's some key standards that I mentioned earlier: 62304 for software development, 62366 for user interface development, 14971 for risk management. You want to make sure your technical file is aligning with your quality management system. So there are times when you're going to need to update the documents in your technical file. Your quality management system should tell you exactly when that is. It should be very clear within your processes. This is where you're updating that. This is where you're updating that. Regulators are, I would say, the previous big, or the 1 or 2 ago big focus of regulators is usability for software. So how users interact with the user interface of your software, how you know that that's safe and you've proved that with them. The biggest thing right now is cybersecurity. So how do you know that your software is secure, that it's not going to leak data, that it's not going to delete data? Big focus on cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk assessments, especially from the FDA over the last few years. Alongside obviously AI as an area that they have specific guidance on as well. Your technical file, in terms of managing it as a project, some documents will feed into other documents. They are dependencies. When you're planning that kind of project, you want to know what is required, what the dependencies are between your different documents. If your development process and the way you document it don't line up, that's not going to work. So there are a number of different methodologies for keeping agile development, but keeping your documentation agile at the same time. You want to try and keep your documents as up to date as you possibly can with your development process. When they become misaligned, that's when you end up with delays and people saying, why do we have to delay this by 3 weeks to do some admin? Well, if you can set up systems and software and methods to keep that documentation up to date as you go, you don't end up with that kind of issue. If you make your documentation structure too complicated, and especially if you're duplicating information in multiple areas, it can get quite messy updating your technical documentation. Try and keep unique pieces of information in one place and then reference it from other documents. So if you have your intended purpose statement, don't copy that statement into multiple documents if you don't have to. Keep it in that one document and refer out to it from other documents. As you're building that technical file, remember you're going to have to update that file at some point as well. So if you can easily pull out a copy of your requirements from wherever you're storing them, for example, into a PDF, remember, write down, tell someone how you did that, set it up as an automatic process, because in 3 months you might be doing it again and you might have forgotten how you pulled it down. Set up your documents with approval routes that are sensible for who needs to approve them. Not everyone in the company needs to approve a document. Tend to break down the types of documents into sort of planning documents and scoping documents explaining what the medical device is and how you intend to develop it. You need risk management, so having a plan for risk management, performing a hazard analysis, which is a specific method that's defined in ISO 14971, how you have to do that. And addressing cybersecurity risks is key in risk management. Then you will have a pretty substantial, depending on the product, testing phase, so testing it internally, testing it with users, clinical evaluation, the process of making sure you have the evidence to support the benefits and the claims that you're making about the product, and that they align and outweigh the risks that you're implementing through the product, is a key portion of your testing and evaluation of the software as well. And then you'll have a set of documents that sort of summarize the technical file. So there's a checklist, the essential requirements for the UK, or the general safety and performance requirements for the EU. is a list of all the medical device requirements, and you have to create a checklist and say how you've met them. A design review is a summary of what you've done and everyone approving that it meets the requirements and the expectations that you've set for the software. Technical documentation summary can be really useful when you're communicating with regulators to explain how your documents work together. Especially if you're working with a notified body, an approved body, or the FDA, have a cover document called a technical documentation summary that explains where they can find that information, because every minute they spend searching for information, they're going to bill you for. So if you can make it easy for them to find stuff, it can be really helpful in getting approved and save you some money. You need to plan how you're going to release the software, how you know that wherever the software is being released to is going to get a valid copy of the software. So the thing that you tested is the thing that the user is going to use. If there's anything in that process that might change it, at the end of it, you need to check whether the software you've delivered to whatever your ultimate location is, whether that's through installation, whether that's through release to a production environment, is what you tested and is the version of the software that you expected it to be. And then a declaration of conformity is a final document that says we as a company have met all these requirements. It's a UK and an EU requirement that you have this document. If you're getting approved by an external body, you would only do that after you've been approved. But for self-certification, the declaration of conformity is the final step. That's you saying this software, this medical device is safe and effective, and we're going to release it onto the market. There are a number of different routes for conformity assessment, which is the process for checking that you have met those regulatory requirements. So in the US, and in UK, EU, and US, there are different methods of self-certification. 510K exempt is what it's called in the US. And as I mentioned, that is you declare that your software, your medical device is safe and effective, and that's it. You're finished. That's the end of the process. If you're class 1 or 510K exempt for the US, that's the mechanism that you would use. You move straight to registering the product with the regulator. Lots of people get confused about who's going to come in and check this document. And I'm like, well, you are. You're going to do it yourself if you're self-certifying. There's no one external who comes and checks if you're on a self-certification route, unless you get an unannounced audit from a regulator. This table shows the responsibilities and the names of the different organizations. So the UK approved body or the EU notified body perform that conformity assessment when you are a class 2A, class 2B, or class 3 medical device. In the US, the technical file can be reviewed by a third-party reviewer or the FDA. If it's for a 510K, but generally it's the FDA who performs the reviews for a product approval. The regulator in the UK is different to the person who approves the medical devices, and same in the EU. It's the MHRA in the UK, and they call them competent authorities in the EU, and there's one per country. And as I mentioned earlier, there's local representatives, and they each have a different name. There are companies that provide these services for each of these territories where you want to register, and they would register with the regulator on your behalf. I'm going to skip that because we're running out of time quickly. The engagement with the notified or approved body, there'll be, this is for the UK and the EU, they will do a quality management system audit. They will do it in multiple phases. So they'll do an initial audit, which is in 2 steps, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1, they come in and see essentially, do you have something worth auditing? Phase 2, they come and do a full audit. They can last, it depends on the size of the company. They tend to be a week or less, but if you're a medium to large size company, they can run for weeks, although they tend to do that by sending multiple auditors. In the 2nd and 3rd year, you'll have a surveillance audit, which is an abbreviated version of that audit. And then in the 4th year, you'll have a recertification. 5th and 6th, it'll be surveillance. So it goes on that 3-year cycle. Within every at least 5 years cycle, you will have an auditor turn up at the address that you've got on your product, whatever address that is, and say, we're here to do an audit, and you will need to do an audit that day. If your quality manager is off, they will understand, but they are staying and doing that audit regardless. That's for class 2A, class 2B, and class 3 medical devices, and anything submitted to the FDA, they can also turn up and do an audit. The FDA don't do them as often generally as notified bodies and approved bodies, but they can turn up and do that. For the technical file review with a notified and approved body, 3 phases. So they review your technical file, they send you a list of questions. They're not questions, they want you to fix the technical file. So if they ask you a question, your answer better be, I have amended this document to say this, this, and this. The answer is not an answer, it is an amendment to your technical file that you're making if you're to answer the question. It's supposed to take 6 months because it's supposed to be a month to review and ask questions, and then a month to answer, and then a month to question, and then a month to answer. I've seen it take up to 12 months to get that back and forth to there. And then there's another portion of governance processes, which is the internal processes of the notified or approved body that can also run for that long. So this is data from the latest data from the EU about how long it takes. The orange is from signing a contract, which does not happen immediately, with a notified body in the EU. How long does it take to get your quality management system approved? Between 6 to 24 months, with a percentage of notified bodies that are running at that rate. And the blue is how long it takes to get your quality management system and your product approved. So only 1 in 20 get approved in less than 6 months. 40% of them are getting approved in a year to a year and a half. 20% are getting approved in a year and a half to 2 years, and 10% are getting approved in over 2 years. That's how long it's taking to go from signing a contract to getting your product released. Onto the EU market.
In the UK, Daniel?
This is the EU.
How does the UK compare?
The UK hasn't published any data on this. The indication that I have, and if anyone from the MHRA has any good data, I'd love to see it. But the people who operate notified bodies and the people who operate approved bodies tend to be very similar people with very similar staff. So the backlog that's impacting on the EU at the moment is often also impacting on the UK. I would expect similar timelines for the UK market, but we don't have any published data on it. And because so few software medical devices fall into Class 2A, there isn't a lot of anecdotal information on it either. The FDA have 3 different methods. 3 is an understatement. 3 most common methods for approval. 510K is proving that you're equivalent to a product that's already on the US market. De novo classification is when you've got a new product, but you don't think it's as risky as a Class 3 product, and you want to ask them to give you a Class 1 or Class 2 classification. And it creates a new one of those 1700 rules I was talking about earlier. And pre-market approval is for the most risky medical devices. There's no saying it's equivalent to an existing product. It's a brand new product, similar to what you would do in the UK or the EU. You need to provide clinical evidence for it. And the PMA is the fullest review. That's the one that can run up to $500,000 to get done. The timelines for the FDA, they do publish timelines by category. So depending on which of those 1700 categories you fall into, they'll tell you how long it takes. They vary quite a lot by category. The FDA have sacked a significant number of their staff this year, but then they've also released a new AI tool that they're going to use to review to review medical device applications. I don't know what that's going to do, whether it's going to speed it up or slow it down. We're still waiting to see how they get on with that, because it's quite a big change at the FDA. So I wouldn't rely on any previous data on timelines for them. There are guidance documents that explains when you need to have a product reapproved. They're linked here. Each territory has a different rule for when you need to get it reapproved by a regulator. And again, you will pay for that if you're paying for a regulator there as well. Registration, each country has a database on which you have to register your medical devices. It's called PARD and DOORS in the UK. It's called EUDAMED in the EU, and they're still working on some of the functionality of that, but some of it is up and running now. The FDA has Establishment Registration Database, Device Listing Database, and the GUDID, which is a list of unique device identifiers, numbers that are assigned to each medical device that are available on the US market. And then reporting or reportable events. This is when your medical device causes or is involved in something that harms a patient or a user. Depending on how serious the harm was and how involved you were, you may or may not have to report, but as soon as you're notified about a reportable event, the clock starts. So if you have a third-party customer support team and they get told your software's just killed someone somehow, your clock has started for reporting. Generally, you have 15 days in the UK or EU and 30 days in the FDA to make a report about a reportable event, but it can be as short as 2 days. That is for devices that could cause major public health events. If it's an individual that may have been harmed, that's where you're at the 15 or 30 days reporting timeline. If you're not sure, if you've not had time to investigate within those days, you have to report and then tell them later what you found out. And the purpose of the reporting is to allow regulators to spot trends and issues with particular medical devices and issue new guidance to address that. Last slide, key takeaways. If you think through your regulatory strategy, which market you want to go on, which classification you want to be, which features you want to include to see if you can reach a different classification, you can get to the market a lot faster, save a lot of heartbreak getting to the end of a process and finding out that either a regulator is going to reject it, or you're in the wrong classification and you now have a whole load more time in terms of delivering what you need to deliver. Especially if you find out that a version of your product that you want to release isn't a medical device and you're expecting to have that medical device timeline in place. Whether you're a medical device or not, the NHS specific requirements will still apply to digital technology for health. There are a number of places and markets where exemptions for software from being software as medical device, like the clinical decision support software in the US, can make that access to market a lot faster. Medical devices need to have evidence of how they're going to benefit patients. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to gather that clinical evaluation data as part of the development of the product. Use what you have already. So if you already have a list of requirements or a list of test protocols or whatever it is, use that to start populating your technical file when you're first creating it, rather than trying to start from scratch. Generally, almost always, it's better to use what you have already and add to it than try and start again from scratch. If you implement your quality management system effectively in a way that people actually engage with and with tools that support its use, you'll reap benefits beyond just compliance. You'll have better training, you'll have better onboarding for staff, you'll have better development processes. But if you view it as just a compliance exercise, you tend to just get the compliance aspect of it. You don't get the benefits from those that you can from a quality management system. I'm aware I've overrun a little bit, Sam, about 13 minutes, Sam, and I apologize. Do we have time for more questions?
Yeah, what I was going to do, so some of the questions definitely feed into later sessions. So I was going to slightly cherry pick at just a couple,
Yeah.
If that's okay. So probably a quick one. Someone self-certifying as class 1, do they need to upload technical files or other documents, struggling to navigate the portal?
If you're self-certifying as a class 1 and you're based in the territory, so in the UK, you only need to upload your declaration of conformity. If you're not based in the UK, you'd need to provide a copy of your technical file to your UK responsible person, and then they would upload the declaration of conformity. But yeah, if you're UK based and you're talking about the UK portal, the only document you end up uploading is the declaration of conformity, which is that final, we declare we have met the requirements of the regulation document.
Perfect, thank you.
And someone's asked about when revisions would constitute a major revision, but I think you had some documents in there that outline when that was.
Yeah, so there are some references there. A key important one that you should all be aware of is it says if your algorithms, I think is the word, it might be models or algorithms change, that's a significant change. So if you're making a new version of your algorithm or a new model that's being implemented, that's considered a significant change by the UK, the EU, and the US. Other instances, if you make significant changes to the user interface in a way that might impact on risk, and if you completely re-architecture your software, that's another instance where you'd do that. But those documents have a load of examples in as well of when a significant, the UK and EU call it a significant change, would occur. Obviously, class 1, that doesn't matter. That only applies to class 2A, class 2B, and class 3.
Great. I'm going to fire two more at you and ask you for a quick answer, which may be a bit unfair on the first one. Alignment between the different countries. Is there going to be changes? Are they going to continue to kind of standardize? What's your outlook?
They'll continue to standardize. The AIaMD are doing a much better job than their predecessor did. The FDA often run the AIaMD so they don't get annoyed about other countries telling them what to do. And even this year or last year, the FDA said they're going to adopt ISO 13485, which is a change 30 years in the making. So yeah, continued alignment in quality management system and technical file requirements. Reporting and registration requirements will continue to be whatever admin and whatever systems and tools the regulators have in those countries.
Thanks, Daniel. And you talk about features in software. What is the guidance on what features are classified or need to be reviewed in the submissions?
The features that deliver or support medical functions. So we talked earlier about that qualification concept of, is it a medical device? It can be useful to work through a piece of software function by function or feature by feature and say which ones are and aren't medical devices, and then look at, so there's a concept in IEC 62304 called segregation.
Yes, please. Yeah. Regular tea now, chicken takeaway.
Someone's getting their tea.
There's a concept called segregation that talks about how you split different portions of a medical device into different risk levels. So yeah, it's worth looking at function by function, and then which functions support other functions. So if you have a page where you fill out patient information or user information, and then the data in there feeds into your algorithm, then that page where you're interacting is a user interface for the algorithm. So that forms part of your medical device, for example.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel. We'll let you have a breather there. Thank you so much.
Was there one about 42,001?
There was, yes. I will repost that, and perhaps you could type a response. Is that all right?
Oh yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll get in the chat.
I've just reposted it again, and the feedback poll's on. So if people could start filling that out while we just wrap up. Daniel, are you able to just take your slides down?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I get one cover just in case? Yeah.
Obviously, you've given us the takeaways there and really set the scene and context, and you covered a lot of things. I've held off some of the questions which we're going to come back to in later sessions. So yeah, don't worry, we will try and cover some of those as well. But thank you so much. Covered a lot there.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for the
time.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk as well.